G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our 2022 webinar series. Thanks so much for joining us today. I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. As you will know, if you've tuned in before, the Australia Institute does do these webinars at least weekly, but the days and times do vary. So head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to sign up for future events. And if you're into tech, don't forget to head on over to the Centre for Responsible Tech. And this Friday, we've got their Burning Platforms regular fortnightly catch up. That should be a good one this week. Well, I'm very excited about today's topic, and it's very topical indeed. Would your younger self believe the news of today? We all know and sense intuitively around us that we're living through a time of fake news and disinformation. And Ed Coper's new book, Facts and Other Lies, Welcome to the Disinformation Age, puts fake news into historical context, explains how disinformation has fractured society, even threatening democracy itself. And more importantly, it explains why disinformation is so potent and so hard to stop, and what we can do to prevent its proliferation here in Australia. He's the author of the book. He was on the front lines when the internet collided with democracy, growing Australia's first online political movement to quickly amass more members than every political party combined. Ed is a leading political communications expert who pioneered techniques to bring politics into the digital age. He's very accomplished, and it's a fascinating book. And today, Ed is going to be in conversation with Peter Lewis, Director of the Australia Institute Centre for Responsible Technology and co-author of the Public Square project. Ed, I'm going to start with you, obviously. Firstly, congratulations on the book. It's a great read. And tell me why it was now the time to write this book.
Well, thanks, Ebony, and hi, everyone. This, as you said, has been a very timely book. And I came to the realization that something like this would be needed when over the course of the last few years, living in the States and seeing firsthand the rise of Trump. In my professional life, I've always used the internet to try to get facts and information to people and to rally around advocacy and political causes. And the way that worked in the early days of the internet changed over the last few years. And it's a radically different place, and it's a place, as the book describes, that really favors extreme opinion and falsehoods. And we really started seeing the real world consequences of that change over the last few years. But there's a whole host of reasons for why, and there's not a lot of accessible resources. Since Trump arrived, there's been a lot of academic research into some of the root causes of this. And there's been some really fascinating studies that have highlighted what it is about technology and our brains that have led to these problems. But much of it's really limited to academic journals. So I really thought it would be a good time to start bringing that all together and looking at the best research on the solutions as well. And when you do that, it's quite surprising. So I felt like a book like this might be a timely resource in the world in 2022.
It certainly seems to be the case, and very topical indeed. And I will just remind everyone online, if you want to ask Ed a question or Pete a question, you can put that in the Q&A box. And a reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat. Ed, I really enjoyed how you kind of went into a bit of the history of truth and lies and what that all means. Why did you think it was so important to kind of give people that context before you dive into why it's all gone to hell in a handbasket?
Well, I think one of the problems broadly when we look at misinformation and disinformation is we really get focused on some of the symptoms, and that's been an approach that has led us to find solutions that aren't really fit for purpose, because we haven't looked at the root causes. And so before we can tell what is different and what has changed in this new disinformation era, we've got to start by acknowledging what isn't different and what hasn't changed. And some of the things that have always been around are the fact that we lie. Lying is a part of normal human evolution. There are some very good reasons why we lie, normally to protect other people's feelings. But there has always been lying. There's always been political lies. That's always been a part of our political discourse. And there's always been disinformation as well. You know, this isn't new. The Cold War was filled with propaganda and disinformation, and the Russians became expert at it. That's not new either. So we've got to look at the context that created these issues to learn what's different and what it is that changed our current era to be one that has tipped the balance towards falsehoods and favouring these conspiracy theories and extreme opinions. And we can't do that without a pretty good working knowledge of how we got here.
Yeah, Pete, I think you were talking earlier to me about being interested in that difference between disinformation and some of the other concepts that Ed explores there.
Yeah, and congratulations on the book, Ed. It's great to see a practical book, a political analysis, and also a great deployment of dad jokes within the same 330 pages. So absolute kudos for the way that you've approached this project. I did like the way you broke down the idea. So, you know, that, the apocryphal story that Eskimos have 100 different words for ice. It's almost breaking the idea of truth and lies into disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and then saying, well, how are those pieces different? And then how do we actually attack each of them? So I think if you look at it as just, we're in this world where no one believes each other, it's almost too big to do anything about it, feels overwhelming. And I thought it was really interesting how you've even got this lovely little table towards the end where you sort of break things down into almost a grid, which I probably is the kind of the tech geek in you that's saying, well, how do we adapt these different elements of the process? So I don't know if it's interesting for those that are in this session, maybe just particularly those three top lines, the difference between mis, dis, and mal, and then how you built those the different, I guess, almost diagnoses and prognoses out of that.
Yeah, no, and it's a great distinction to unpack, because we generally use, misinformation, disinformation as catch-all terms, or fake news is, as a catch-all term to talk about quite a lot. And as you say, there's the problem with doing that is that the issue gets a bit too big to grasp, and the solutions are a bit nebulous. So misinformation really just refers to any false or faulty information. And sometimes there can be perfectly legitimate reasons for that. So one of the best examples of good misinformation is satire. When the Batuta Advocate puts out a story, it's a wonderfully important piece of information that is serving a very legitimate purpose, but it technically is misinformation because it's not true. Or potentially a journalist might make a perfectly honest mistake and then issue a correction later. That is also misinformation. This is false information that's been put out there. Malinformation is information that may be true, but is put out there with a malicious intent. So revenge porn might be a good example. That's not misinformation, but it is information that is being weaponized for some nefarious purpose. And then disinformation is false information that is put out there to deliberately deceive people for some kind of ulterior motive as well. So that's what the book is really interested in unpacking and focusing on, because the disinformation landscape is very sophisticated, it's very effective, and people have found incredibly powerful ways to manipulate online platforms and manipulate us by spreading false information. They're able to do it in ways that look like real information that our brains will willingly accept as truth. and then connect to other people in this networked world to spread disinformation with a passion and a purpose. And that is a really powerful formula. And it's how these very strange and clearly false ideas can all of a sudden become strong narratives that will drive people to get in their truck and drive to Canberra and protest on the lawns of Parliament House with these very passionately held beliefs. So that's what disinformation is. And that's really what the important thing to unpack is, because that's what's open to manipulation. And that's what really severs some of the key links in our democracy.
And a lot of the context for that is that it happens on social media platforms, particularly Facebook. Is that what really kind of took this perhaps phenomena that's been occurring for a long time and just kind of turbocharged it?
Yeah, that's the big hairy elephant in the room. That's the thing that changed between the early utopian days of the internet, where we all celebrated the fact that we could bypass censorship and connect to each other and spread our truth around the world on a level playing field. The problem with that is these days there's way too much information on the internet. We have access to literally everything, and that creates a volume of information that is too much for anyone to handle. And if people who've had a Facebook account for a long time would remember that the reason it's called a timeline is because it used to be quite literally every post your friends posted in chronological order that they posted. Now, you might have thousands of friends on your Facebook feed. It's just too unwieldy. And so the platforms that served us information had to start making decisions about which information they would service. And to do that, they relied on what we call an algorithm, which is just simply a mathematical process of taking various pieces of information to make a decision about what you, Ebony, not anyone else, but you in particular, want to see on your Facebook feed. Someone, they might think that one of your friends is closer than another, and prioritize their content. But it's a lot more sophisticated than that. They know everything about you. So they might think that one particular niche gardening topic is something that you'd be really interested in. And they might see that a lot of other people on their platform are interested in the same niche gardening topic. So they decide that you want to see this particularly engaging piece of gardening content that Peter might not be interested in. And so that's what they put there for you to digest. Now, that's a fairly innocuous example. The problem is that same process, if you are someone who instead is an anti-vaxxer, then they will know, and the algorithm will decide that you will want to see anti-vaccination content, and they will shield you from any counter factual information that might correct that mistaken belief. And so this is what we call the filter bubble effect, where because of the way the platforms present you information, that they only want to show you things that you will engage with and you are interested in, then that just pushes people down rabbit holes. And a lot of people who are members of extremist groups on Facebook were recommended those groups by the algorithm. They didn't find them organically. It wasn't a friend who suggested it to them. It was the platforms themselves that said, hey, you sound like a neo-Nazi. You might be interested in joining this neo-Nazi group.
But it actually even goes one level deeper than just the filter bubbles. And I think you touch on this in the book too, Ed, but I want to draw it out. It's not just that the recommendations are benign. There is also this acceptance within Facebook that the number one priority for a user is to have them engaged and to be online longer, because then they're giving more of their behavioral information up that they can harvested, repurposed, sold for advertising. So as was disclosed in the Facebook papers from Frances Haugen, who was the internal whistleblower last year, Facebook knows full well that information that's designed to either anger or enrage or excite users is more potent. People will stay on longer and engage more deeply. So it is not just that you are getting what you want, you are getting the loudest version of what you want. And that creates an aesthetic, I think, on these platforms, that everything is catastrophized, everything is big, everything is outrageous. And as you make the point in the book, that actually leads to a world which isn't conducive to considered conversation. I love at one point you compare the way the right now does politics on the platforms, which is just throw a lot of memes and get people angry, to hosting an Australia Institute webinar, which is like a slow version of sharing ideas and thinking things through. And I think we're all a bit naive when the internet started being used for politics, that it was going to be a platform that supported the left and supported progressive just because we got there early. I think Obama was the proof point that the internet was progressive. I always make the point, Obama's no proof point. Obama was Obama, a once in a generation politician that was going to thrive in whatever context he rose up in. But I think we caught a trick here and have been paying the price ever since, because the tools that we use to mobilize and mass fundraise have now been used for a whole lot of different reasons. And I don't think we saw it coming. So there's a few things there, but I think it does go to the business model of the platforms and how they're not benign in the way they operate politically.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a fundamental part of the issue that we all need to grasp. And, you know, the easiest way to think about it is that the early days of the internet favored hope, and now the internet favors hate. So Obama was really from the era of hope, and Trump was from the era of hate. And we saw in their campaigns the evolution from the internet being somewhere that progressives could use to spread positive ideas to one that is more social media driven now, that favors inflammation, outrage, hyperpartisanship, and false information. So I call this the megaphone, which I invite everyone to borrow that term, because I think it's important to understand that Trump and his followers is not some foreign domestic political interest that we can watch as a spectator from other countries. This is a global movement that is represented by the MAGA set, and it's everywhere from the lawns of Wellington to Parliament in Wellington, to the lawns of our own Parliament, to Ottawa, to Europe and Russia and Ukraine right now. And so we really need to grasp exactly this dynamic that you mentioned. And that is that the megaphone is something that can take the type of Fox News style outrage that even Fox News isn't evolved enough there. That's Breitbart and InfoWars and Alex Jones and all of the rest of the really far right shock jock ecosystem. They take that type of falsehood laden outrage and you put it on social media, and the platforms love it. And then you give it to people who support those sorts of ideas, and they are so good at forming groups, finding each other, sharing that information, and not just sharing it, but weaponizing it. They get that if you can make something ricochet around the internet, then it becomes a narrative that can dominate society and political discourse. And we saw that in America when you have an unexpected society-changing event like the pandemic coming along, that when the traditional institutions in America thought that they could act and behave in the traditional way of giving public health advice and expecting people to listen to information and compliantly follow the directions to safety, the cupboard was bare. They didn't. America decided this was a political problem, not a public health problem, because of this megaphone and the power of it, where they could decide that a mask mandate was actually a conspirational direction from political elites to control them, and that became the reality. We saw it in the aftermath of the election there in 2020, where one candidate clearly lost, and rather than accepting the results, they could just create their own reality and carry on as if that result never happened. So they are a bit further down the rabbit hole, but the same thing is happening in Australia and elsewhere in similar Western liberal democracies. So the megaphone is something that works symbiotically with how social media platforms work. And it was no slight to the Australia Institute style webinars, which I love and endorse, but unfortunately we can't compete. If you put this video on a social media platform, it's not going to be able to compete against the latest far right meme about some wild conspiracy theory.
Can I just jump in one more bit there? It's almost the difference between reaction, which, reactionary is the right-wing playbook, versus movement building. There's another book I'll put in the chat for people that are interested that's just come out called The Quiet Before by a guy called Gal Beckerman. And he makes the point that if you look at social movements and political movements from the decolonization movement in Africa to the democracy movement in Russia in the Cold War, and a whole bunch more in between, movements take time, and the building of a movement is not something that happens in a share or a meme. And he contrasts that with some of the fast sort of the Arab Spring, those sort of fast collectivist movements that don't have the same resilience underneath them. And I think I've actually got a view that a lot of what the left does on social media is an absolute waste of time. And that can be sort of maybe a discussion that can go into when we're talking about the next election. But it seems to me you can't micro-target yourself to political change. You can build a list, you can send them shit, but does it actually do the job that movement building has traditionally done?
I think these movements are different and they behave differently. And the vast majority of disinformation spreads organically, not through advertising. I think a lot of people think of fake ads driving a lot of this, but it is there is a very rapid breakdown in traditional social and ideological groupings across society. And one of the first moments where a lot of people realized this was Brexit, where how the UK traditionally was divided was completely irrelevant for an issue like Brexit, which was disinformation driven. A lot of the information around the Brexit vote was just purely social media disinformation. And they found that people didn't divide along traditional Labor and Conservative lines. And we've seen that survive post-Brexit, where in Hartlepool, which is one of the safest Labor seats in the UK, they just lost in a by-election last year because it was staunchly pro-Brexit, whereas a lot of the UK Labor has come to represent, the Remain camp. And so we're seeing this in America as well, where a lot of the Trump ecosystem is not through the traditional political and social groupings that we've seen. And we see it in Australia on issues like the pandemic, where you can have far-right white nationalists now in alliance with far-left hippie health influencers on Instagram because their views align on vaccine mandates. And so how do you define these as movements? They're not the same as previous social and political movements. And one of the reasons for their success and the speed of their success is that they've proven to be very flexible because they're not ideologically driven. So QAnon is the best example of this. QAnon started as a very specific conspiracy theory about Democrats in the US and Hillary Clinton. And it has been able to survive missing many of the milestones they predicted as part of that conspiracy, that Donald Trump was the secret savior sent on a certain date to arrest all of the Democratic elites. Now, when that didn't happen, QAnon didn't go away. They just changed their beliefs, and they've become this big umbrella movement to incorporate everything from anti-lockdown, anti-vaxxers to flat earthers to everything in between. A lot of the very old conspiracy theories around banking elite families and you name it. And they're not driven by the specific ideas. They're driven by much more human need. And part of the book is dedicated to psychology and cognitive biases, because we can't begin to understand these issues without understanding how our brains work. And it's such a fundamentally important piece of the puzzle, because we're never going to change the way our brains are geared. That has built over thousands of years of evolution. But we are living in an era where the megaphone and social media and these movements, they are tapping into our pre-built cognitive biases. They play into the ways our brain work in a much more comfortable way than, say, progressives package their content, or the way we give facts and think that facts will somehow cure a lot of these falsehoods, because our brains don't like that. Our brains don't like the way that we present that type of information to correct people. Our brains like the conspiracy. We like the Trump-fueled ecosystem of extreme opinion and shocking emotive content. Those bits of our brains will win out over the rational parts of our brains any day. So it's a big piece of the puzzle.
Pete, I was going to ask you, don't we have an online social harms inquiry at the moment does that shed any light on this problem?
Well, they've actually handed down their report yesterday, and and I'll put a link to it in the chat. From what I can see, their strongest recommendation is the platform should do what they said they were going to do, which is probably not the full gamut of government regulation here. We do have a situation at the moment where the platforms have signed up to self-regulation. There is a self-regulatory industry code. Most people think it's pretty, it's unenforceable and we don't really know what's going on. They also this week, Meta, old Facebook, had a big press briefing on what they would be doing for this year's federal election, which again kind of seemed to me to be, I will put a few people on. They used the term, we're going to have dedicated staff, which I love that term, dedicated as a term. It sounds like they're going to be working, 24 hours a day.
Pete,
they've got someone dedicated to taking the calls from the political parties at least. And one of the issues last time, and Ed was much closer to the action than I was that when the death tax disinformation started spreading in social, Facebook was really slow to respond. It built a life of its own. If we want to go a bit bigger for this election, so we've got this inquiry, which doesn't really take us too much further, except saying that we should have the e-safety commissioner with more hands-on on the harms, which is fine. My concerns still are we've got no truth in political advertising laws. We haven't actually got a regulated or any media regulator with teeth. It's self-regulation for the traditional media. We've got self-regulation for platforms. So this is all operating. Our democracy and our elections are basically being driven on the basis of trust, and also on the basis that the participants are good faith actors. Now, there is an argument, for instance, that death tax was the response to Mediscare that our side of politics ran in 2016. And I do think there is a sense that I don't know how you build some sort of rules of engagement for the major parties on how they run their elections, because power's a really big prize. But I do think that this election, we are going to see the next iteration of a really unhygienic information ecosystem. And then it all comes down to the vote on, it's going to be early May. And I think there's going to be a lot of things that happen that it takes a long time to understand. Even the role of the big money that a guy like Palmer's putting in behind it, where does that go? And the one other thing I'll throw in there, and sorry, this is a bit of a suit, but we've got problems with regulation. We've got problems with self-regulation on the platforms. We've also got this sense that Facebook doesn't even offer academics real access to understand what's going on underneath the hood. So if you think about it, our democracy is this big vehicle that's driving down the road. We've got no idea what makes the engine run, and people are putting a lot of shit in it to just keep it running. And there's no clear, there's no clear air act either. So we've got no engine control and no pollution control. That's a tortured analogy. Sorry, Ed.
Ed, I was going to ask you, that reminded me of the bit in the book where you talk about the way that we approach myth busting actually reinforces myths. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, all related to that election soup that you outlined there, Peter, too. So we tend to only address disinformation once the toothpaste is out of the tube, and it's very hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube. And so a lot of the responses to disinformation fail because it's far too late, and we go about it all the wrong way. And if you look at, if we unpack the example of the death tax disinformation, the way that Labor responded to that in 2019 fell into a couple of common traps. One, they responded by saying, we do not have a death tax. Now, anyone who's worked in communications knows that's one of the oldest precepts, is that you don't negate what the opponent's saying. All everyone hears when you say we don't have something is whatever you say you don't have. And the other thing they did was to make a really loud song and dance about it, and to complain through the media that that Facebook wasn't taking down this disinformation that they had a death tax. And a lot of people heard about the death tax through that media campaign. And so the net effect of that was really just amplifying the issue. Now, the way we generally approach disinformation is usually similar to those types of tactics. And we think if we present a corrective fact, that it will change the mind of someone who is misinformed. There's no neurological scientific basis for that. In fact, with a lot of political disinformation, it is probably counterproductive, because when something is closely aligned to our identity, we see corrective information as threatening. And so we throw up our mental defenses, and it reinforces our previous idea rather than corrects it. And so that political disinformation is often playing into that same kind of minefield. And there's also studies that show when myth busting appears to have worked, they go away and you ask that person a couple of days later and they've just reverted back to their mistaken belief. So it can work on the best case scenario. You see, you survey someone, they said, yes, I was completely wrong. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I believe you, I'm corrected. And then you ask them a couple of days later and they think it rises in the west and sets in the east. So there's a whole host of reasons why those standard approaches don't work. Now, what would have worked in the death tax example, or the Mediscare example, which I will say was not disinformation, as someone who was promoting that information, but it's not the fact that Labor couldn't come out and say we don't have a death tax and that would be effective, and the Liberals couldn't have come out and said we love Medicare. We don't. We're not going to privatise Medicare. That wouldn't have been effective, because there are much stronger background narratives that people believe about Labor and tax and the Liberals and public health care that are stronger than any piece of corrective information. So if you want to correct someone who thinks Labor will introduce a death tax, you have to win that overarching narrative about Labor and taxes. And if you want to correct someone who thinks the Liberals will privatise Medicare, then you've got to win that overarching narrative about the Liberals and public health funding. But we don't do that. We tend to focus on the specific disinformation rather than the broader narrative. If people went into the 2019 election believing a really strong Labor narrative about taxes, then they would have been impervious to any death tax disinformation, because it would have butted up against an existing fact in their head. But where it aligns with an existing fact in their head, or encounters a vacuum because people haven't formed an opinion, then that's when disinformation is successful. But we tend to focus on after the fact and do little on the inoculation before the fact.
I want to get to solutions in just a second and talk about, what does work. But just a reminder, if you're on the webinar with us, you can type in questions for Ed and Pete, if you like, and we'll get to those in just a second. But before we move on to solutions, I was struck by the bit where, you do kind of talk about the social media platforms really creating this ecosystem and how important it is to spreading this type of thing when Donald Trump tried to take his audience offline to his own blog and nothing really happened. Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, it was like a wonderful experiment that they ran for us, an A/B test, as you call it, where let's take Donald Trump, everything that Donald Trump says, and in one version of the experiment, we'll put it on social media, and on the other version of the experiment, let's just put it on his website without any algorithmic bias. And surprise, surprise, he is wildly successful on social media and completely tanked, and nobody read his blog on his website when it was just his standalone ideas. So the implication there is that without the thumb on the scale that the social media provides for that sort of partisan political misinformation, it doesn't really go anywhere. So the platforms are key to the solutions here. They really are the driving force. We can't lay all of the responsibility or blame at the feet of any one platform, because we've seen that these movements will migrate from platform to platform. When they are taken off Facebook, they will go on to Telegram or form their own censorship-free social media platforms like Gab and Parler in the US that Trump supporters have migrated onto. So it's another big piece of the puzzle that we need to understand about how these things aren't successful in a vacuum.
Yeah, so just before we move to questions from the audience, can you talk to us a little bit about how we prevent this from becoming entrenched in Australia? And then Pete, I might get you to respond. How long do we have? There's so many solutions because this is a society-wide problem, and they start at the very big and long-term end, which is we need to embed digital media literacy into our curriculum. And we need to teach adults those skills, not just students who are coming through the education system, because we are fighting a 21st century problem with 20th century tools and a 20th century understanding. And so that's not just about teaching someone, how to recognize a fake headline or a true headline. That's about just teaching people about the information environment that we live in, and how to live in that safely and truthfully. That's an issue as much for cyberbullying as it is for disinformation. This is just a brave new world that we have to have skills for. Then there are policy responses that governments have been traditionally quite bad at offering meaningful solutions, because they focus on either foreign interference, which yes is a problem we need to address, but that's not going to prevent the Trump-style breakdown of our social divisions in Australia. That's a problem of our own domestic making. That's not something that the Russians or the Chinese are manufacturing for us. And then there's the platforms themselves who absolutely can do a much better job of preventing people from being drawn down into these rabbit holes, and for the algorithms recommending really harmful behaviours and information to people. And then there's the individual level, where our own behaviour as social media citizens can be problematic if we are a vector for disinformation, or we are trying to address disinformation in the wrong way. So there are a couple of things that we can all do better ourselves, and one of which is telling better stories. Conspiracy theories and disinformation wins usually because it's a better story. And we try to defeat a story like Bill Gates manufactured COVID to control the population. That's a good story, and we try to defeat that with peer-reviewed scientific articles, which just aren't as engaging. We've got to tell an equally engaging story about the reality of what a triumph it was to make these vaccines, and what an unprecedented feat of collective human scientific achievement that was. But we tend not to tell those stories. So there is a whole gamut of solutions across the board that we can do, but most of them are focused on inoculation and preventing disinformation. By far and away, that's more easy and effective to do than addressing any specific disinformation after the fact. Yeah, Pete, I know that's something that you've thought a lot about as well. In terms of solutions in this book and others that you've come to, how's Australia going?
Look, I think we've accepted there is a problem like most Western democracies. I think that the approach is pretty piecemeal, and you'll see a specific problem like sexting or kids being bullying, and you try to build the systemic response, or Christchurch massacre. And it's almost like, and we were talking about this the other week on burning platforms as well, you tend to build your system based on the black swan event rather than trying to think through the system you want. So you're almost kind of saying, oh my God, something bad's happened. How do we stop the bad thing happening, rather than how do we imagine a system that works? So I do think the platform accountability is really important, but I also think we need to recognize the business models that underpin the platforms will always push them to being really dangerous distributors of information. So anything you do to restrict them is against their business interests, which is why I end up in a space that says we need to actually imagine alternate networks, alternate ways of connecting. The Public Square project was trying to think that through, at least our civic life. How do we design systems that bring out civic discussion, allow us to run our democracy in ways which are constructive experiences and not just prize fights. And I just don't think that systems that are built on a business model that is, is designed to anger and excite and distort gets us there. The second piece, which I'm really interested in Ed saying we've got to beat them with better stories. I think we've really got to be mindful on the progressive side about how we engage in our politics. Of course, winning is important, but also understanding that the politics is not just about winning elections. It's also about building Overton windows and building theories of change. I think it's beyond just seeing if we can do better on the platforms to get more people liking us and therefore translating that to votes. There's another great book. So it's often a really good book comes with a series of other things. Another one I put in the chat is called The Story Paradox, which has just come out by a guy called Jonathan Gottschall, who actually writes even more profound that the history of narrative that you spoke about before, and lies are embedded in that, but also the way that we look at the world is in this idea of telling stories where there is the hero and the villain. We make the villain really one-dimensional. The hero goes on this journey. They sort of face challenges and ultimately triumph. And it's just the line going through so much, not just of our literature, but also the way that we understand the word. And Gottschall makes the point, this is actually part of the problem, that we've chosen to tell the world and understand the world in stories, and stories inherently distort what really happens, which we've got a whole bunch of people with different views of the world, and we're trying to build a consensus. And the whole notion of storytelling needs to be challenged as well. And I know that's way beyond this election cycle or the next, but I know always if I'm banging out a media release and trying to get sort of a bit of politics going, I make the enemy a bad guy. I ascribe all these negative characteristics to them. I turn them into a bully or a villain, and it's so easy to do. It's much harder to find ways of getting purchase in richer storytelling. So I don't know, maybe I'm singing Kumbaya today, but I thought it's a really good book, and we'll share it in the chat.
Well, I just want to add one thing, Ebony. I forgot in the solutions that you reminded me of there, Peter. Is that the platforms were never designed to do this, because they're filling a vacuum that was created by the mass extinction events of local and regional and publicly funded news. So that we can't talk about this without saying, if we were to reinvest in a healthy news landscape, then that would also be probably one of the best things we could do.
Yeah, and also that the news, part of my thing, the ABC's never made the transition from being a broadcaster to being a network and managing two-way communication flows. Currently, the ABC outsources all their crowd stuff to Facebook. There's government departments do their community consults. You got to register to Facebook to actually make a comment. Surely we can do better than this. I've got no problem with Facebook if people want it, sharing their families and information and their photos, and also being sold stuff. If they know you want a sneaker and they send you a sneaker, I reckon that's fine. It's just when it goes into ideas, that's where I start saying, surely we need to have a better place for us to, be gathering and sort of thinking this stuff through.
Yeah, but Ed is right too about that investment in local journalism and news, and other countries have made that a priority, thinking of news, public interest journalism as, a public good, essentially, like sewage systems that work and a functional defense force. You need a strong local news and public interest journalism system, and other countries have really chosen to invest in that and public broadcasting as a bit of a counter. So the book again is Facts and Other Lies by Ed Cooper. I can see a couple of questions here from the audience. I'm going to start with one from, and now I've lost it in the chat here. It was from Linda, and it was, would compulsory critical thinking courses in schools begin to change these problems, such courses addressing the way our brain leads us astray and how to check information? Can you tell us in a little bit more detail about that, Ed?
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic question. And it would be a fantastic solution. So one of the things I like to talk about, because people tend to think when they think of disinformation that there is a group of people over here that are susceptible to it and have bought into it and have been completely sucked in by the disinformation ecosystem. And we might be over here who are fact-based and rational and truthful. But it's much better to think of us as individuals, and that we all have parts of our brain that can be led by disinformation and are emotional and respond to emotive triggers. And we have parts of our brain that are rational and truthful and led by reason. And internally, every individual is locked into a competition between these competing parts of our brains. Now, the irrational parts of our brains are incredibly powerful, and disinformation piggybacks those in order to be effective. But it's not like there are some rational people and some irrational people. We all have the same cognitive processes. And so an education in critical thinking is fundamental for people to understand that and to approach this problem from one that is common to all people, rather than to approach it as a problem that affects a subset of society. And that can lead to us thinking just as much as an us and them or an other mentality about people who are out on the streets protesting things that are completely not fact-based, and they treat us as others as well. And that's why they become so hostile to mainstream rational fact-based thought, because we treat it like that. So critical thinking education is really about making people aware of the information processes that are part of normal human cognition, and being able to recognize it in ourselves and others. And definitely that would lead us to a place where we're better able to respond to the challenges that represents.
I've got a question here from Eddie Otto, who is just challenging the idea that political misinformation and disinformation became prominent only in the Trump era, and citing things like children overboard here in Australia. I know in the book you do go into kind of the history and that all of that has already been with us, but what's the difference there between acknowledging that lies have always been part of political life to kind of what we've seen happen in the United States?
Well, I think there's a mainstream narrative in Australia that children overboard was a lie that was ultimately exposed and yes, had some consequences, but as a society we reverted to a truthful mean. And that's the traditional way we've approached political lying. Political lying were opportunities to exploit a moment and to gain from that by lying about the presence or the absence of something. And eventually that would be exposed, and there may or may not be political consequences to that. That's what we experienced with children overboard. And the difference with the Trump era, and I'm not suggesting that Trump was different from other politicians and that John Howard was entirely truthful and Donald Trump was entirely false. although I will say they did count 70% of everything Trump said in 2016 was false. So maybe the volume is there, but that's not the point. It's just they're in different eras, and the effect of Trump's lies were very different from the effect of Howard's lies. In the Trump era, we never revert to the sensible, truthful mean. We don't expose the lies down the track, and that moment for political exploitation has disappeared, and there are consequences for it. We're able to fracture into ongoing realities that live parallel to each other, where instead of saying to Trump, "Oh, good try, you tried to steal the 2020 election, but now we know it was all a big con. Thank you very much for coming." People continue to inhabit a reality that he won that election. And that's a very big problem, because we don't have the shared reality where we can disagree about things and debate about the consequences. But instead, we live in completely parallel realities that never intersect.
Pete, is there anything you'd like to add to that one?
Let's go to the next question.
All right. The next question is from John McCann. He says, how can we anticipate disinformation memes in order to be ahead and inoculate conversations against them?
Yeah, another great question. So we know, we talked a little bit about the upcoming election, and one thing we know is that there's going to be a real competition for this new political constituency that has coalesced around the pandemic. And as we were saying before, it's not traditional party lines. And so there's going to be a real race to the bottom to capture that vote. We know that Craig Kelly and Clive Palmer are doing their darndest to be the party that represents that disinformation-laden section of the electorate. And a lot of this is going to come through, as you say, these types of memes on the internet. And, to go back to, the story-based campaigning that Peter was talking about before, is memes are effective because our brain likes taking shortcuts, and they can often be a good way to tell a complex story in a very easy way that our brain can make sense of. So the way we inoculate against this kind of social media disinformation during an election is to do a couple of things. One that we've already mentioned is to be out there first on the front foot with a stronger dominant narrative, so that when those things arrive, the audiences are just less impervious to it because it contradicts something they already think. That is absolutely fundamentally what you should be doing, is in the competition for ideas, is being out there with your ideas first. The other thing we can do is to talk about disinformation in general, and to warn about disinformation and the sorts of tactics that we will see in the upcoming election. So some of the most promising research has found that when you make people play an online game where the goal is to get the most followers by spreading hypothetical disinformation, and in doing so, you learn about all the tactics that social media spreads disinformation. You try to game the system and get a lot of followers, and it's perfectly innocuous hypothetical disinformation. But they have found that everyone who has played this game is subsequently much more likely to recognize disinformation when they see it, and much less likely to believe and share disinformation when they see it. And they believe it is just working like a vaccine. They are given harmless doses of a deactivated form of the virus. They produce mental antibodies, so that when they encounter it in the real world, their mental antibodies give them some layer of protection against it. So that's what we need to be doing. I mean, this webinar is doing it. We're talking about the issue. We're warning people to watch out for it in the upcoming disinformation, to tune our radars, to look out for it. That has been proven to be very effective.
Pete, I might send this next one to you first. Maxine Cadzo says, how politically powerful will Facebook be in the future?
Well, they're about to take over the next frontier, the metaverse. The renaming of Meta is this thesis that we're all going deeper into the internet. And I think they're right on that. I think we're deeper into the internet in an event like this. We're in a virtual room, we're sharing ideas. Facebook wants to own that, and they want to normalize the behavior of having avatars in in meetings and in social settings. I don't know if people want that. And I know that anyone that's had an Oculus, it's a pretty weird experience at the moment, but their ambitions are huge, right? And the whole model is, again, extracting the behavioral insights of what we do so that they can not just sell us stuff, but shape our behavior to sell us more stuff. It is why it is essential to start thinking through alternates and to encourage. I actually believe you've got to encourage people off these platforms. And I know, like, I'm off them. I probably miss out on information about what some school friend that I haven't seen for 35 years is doing. But I just feel that for all of us, we need, it's not just about digital literacy. It's also knowing that if you're in a place that's dangerous, you need to know why you're there. It's why I use DuckDuckGo as my search engine. If I'm really, really wanting to find something, I'll jump onto Google and give up a little bit of my data because it's not as good, because it hasn't got as broad an insights. But I think we've got to be much more critical in our thinking about this. So we need, as a society, to build alternate structures, and we need to change our behavior as well, because they are so big now that they're not going to, you can't regulate them into good behavior because their business model works the opposite way. You can't wish them away. They're there, and we've got to find the alternatives. And a viable alternative is just not another version of them doing the same thing either. It's got to be much more radical, the thinking that goes on behind this.
Yeah. And I might come to you on that as well. Obviously, they're hugely powerful. How successful have governments been in attempts to regulate them?
Oh, terribly unsuccessful so far. You know, the Facebook is much more sophisticated at getting ahead of government regulation than governments are at regulating it. And in fact, I don't think a lot of governments realize Facebook uses regulation as a weapon to be anti-competitive by by controlling the regulation and working with government to control the regulation they have. It prevents any competitors from entering the market because they've built a regulatory moat around themselves that is so cost prohibitive that no player could ever come and compete against Facebook. So I don't think governments understand they're a bit of an unwitting pawn in that process. We haven't done a good job because we've taken the public square and put it behind this private gated community, as you know, Peter was talking about and has written about as well. That we used to give that power to the traditional media companies, and we asked a lot in return. We set very strict parameters. We said you can have access to Australians' hearts and minds and brains, and you will be responsible for giving them information. But that comes with a trade-off. There's a quid pro quo. It needs to be truthful. You need to follow certain journalistic and ethical standards, and we will regulate that. When we move that function behind these social media company paywalls, we never ask for the same in return. And as Pete said, the problem with doing that is these are private companies that have shareholder returns as their prime motivating factor and their responsibility. So it's very hard to for governments to keep pace with technological developments. It's a very fast-moving landscape, and governments are slow-moving, and there's very good reasons for that. And so there's a bit of a mismatch there in terms of the control that technology platforms and companies have over our lives with the regulatory framework that governments have to set parameters around that.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks very much, everyone, for your time today. The book, again, is Facts and Other Lies by Ed Koper. You can find it in all good bookstores. It's a cracking read, definitely worth your while before the election, at least. Inoculate yourselves against disinformation for sure. Congratulations on the book, Ed. Thanks for joining us, Pete. Everyone, if you're interested in this type of topic, please join us again and the Centre for Responsible Technology on Friday at 1 p.m. For our regular Burning Platforms event. You can find that on the Centre for Responsible Technology website. And I think Pete posted a link to it earlier in the chat. But thank you so much for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but hopefully hopefully this leaves you all a little bit better armed as we head into the next election. Thanks so much again, Ed. Thanks everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks everyone.
All right.
Bye.